Detectives in Togas, Chapter 19. "Where?" the others cried, and were making a dash for the window when Antonius warned them back. "Keep down so we won't see you." They ducked down to the floor, crawled to the window, then peered cautiously over the sill. Xanthopus, too, hugging the wall, had made his way to the window. "Where do you see him?" he asked. "Over there," Antonius whispered. On the other side of the street, a short, fat man was walking rapidly in the direction of the Forum. He was wearing a cloak with a hood which had drawn over his head. "How do you know he is Tellus?" Mucius asked in a low voice. "I recognized him right away," Antonius said. "His hood blew off for a moment, and I saw his bald head in the scar. I'll swear it's him. He glanced over here, too, but he didn't see me." "Probably he's going to visit Lucos," Xanthopus murmured. But Tellus walked past Lucas's house and stopped 3 houses farther down the street in front of the bakery. He turned around and took a long look at the Xanthos school and then vanished inside the baker's shop. "He's gone to buy some rolls," Flavius exclaimed in amazement. Xanthopus hobbled to his bed, sat down on it, and began rubbing his leg. In straightening up from the floor, he had moved too quickly and hurt himself again. The boys gathered around in concern, but the pain seemed to ease up. Then their teacher gave them his verdict. "A millionaire does not go out himself to buy rolls," he said. "In fact, he hardly goes anywhere without his slaves and the hangers-on. All this is very suspicious. Perhaps Tellus has discovered the disappearance of the cloak and chain and is going to confer with somebody there." "Meeting the Red Wolf," Antonius exclaimed. Xanthopus shrugged. "Whoever it is, it would be interesting to find out what he is doing." "I'll run over and look," Mucius suggested. "No," Xanthopus said. "It would be dangerous for you to go alone. A cornered criminal will stop at nothing. It's better for you to all go together. When there are 6 of you, and you are much safer. But stick together all the time and be careful. If you are threatened, get out. I don't want any foolish heroism." Mucius, Antonius, Cassius, and Julius ran off, wild with enthusiasm. Publius followed them with a mocking expression. He thought nothing would come of this whole undertaking. As usual, Flavius brought up the rear. The cloudburst had turned the roadway into a rushing stream. The boys hopped across by way of the missing blocks of stone which were placed in the roadway at regular intervals, making a bridge from one sidewalk to the other for the use of pedestrians during just storms as this. They raced down the sidewalk and charged into the bakery like the Persians into the pass at Thermopylae. The baker, who was busy kneading some dough in a trough beside his oven, looked up in astonishment. "Hey, have you kids gone crazy?" he asked good-naturedly. "Are you planning to conquer Carthage for the 2nd time, or is school out?" He knew the boys well, for they were good customers of his. They always came around during the breakfast recess and brought piles of rolls and stacks of cookies, or bought piles of rolls and stacks of cookies. Tellus was nowhere in sight. The boys went all over the shop looking for him, while the baker watched them in wonder. Whatever become of that short, fat man who was in here a while ago, the one in the hooded cloak? Mucius asked. The baker laughed. "Oh, him," he replied, pointing at the door in the back of the shop. "He just went through there." "Why? What is he doing?" Julius and Mucius burst out. "He's a queer bird, he is," the baker said. He pulled the dough free from his arms and hands and tossed it back into the trough and began kneading it again. "He comes in through here 3 or 4 times a week, comes in the front door and goes out the back." "Why?" the boys chorused. The baker shrugged. "Jupiter knows," he said indifferently. "And that's all you know about him?" Mucius pressed. "Absolutely," the baker assured him. "I don't ask him any questions. What do I care anyway? He pays me 100 sesterces a month for the right to go through. I bet if he counted up all his money, he'd have more than all the rolls I've ever baked in all my life. Once I made a mistake and asked him, 'Hey, you there in the hood, where in the world do you go to?' And do you know what he did? He up and drew a sword from under his cloak, glared at me like the hell-bound Cerberus, and said, 'If you value your life, don't think about it.'" Since then, I haven't thought about it. I do value my life, even though I have to wear myself out earning a living. I have a family to support, and 100 sesterces a month isn't chicken feed. The boy stared at the back door. When does he come back? Julius asked. Back? The baker repeated. By Pluto, he never comes back. He comes in at the front, goes out at the rear, but never returns. Mucius went slowly toward the back door. Where does this lead? He asked. Nowhere, the baker replied. That's the end of the store. There must be something, Publius said, pushing the door open slightly. You better not stick your head out, the baker called to him. First thing you know, he'll chop it off with that sword of his. But Mucius showed no sign of fear. He opened the door, leaned forward, and looked out on both sides. The others came up from behind him and squeezed through the doorway, trying to see also. Before them, in the gray twilight, lay a bare courtyard. About 10 or 12 yards away rose a high wall. Beyond that must be the field of Mars, for over the top of the wall they could see the crowns of cypress trees swaying in the wind. On their right, the wall of the next building projected so that they could not see where the yard ended. We ought to have a look around that corner at any rate, Mucius said. No harm in that, Julius murmured. Come on, Mucius said. They pulled their togas up to cover their heads and stepped out into the rain. Peering around the projecting wall, they saw that the yard extended as far as a high, massive building that stood at an angle to the other houses. There was no one in sight, and the boys boldly pressed forward. They stayed close to the walls of the buildings, paying no attention to the deep puddles. Where could Tellus have vanished to? The low houses adjoining the bakery had either doors nor windows in the rear. Tellus could not have entered any of them. But then they came to a tower-like building made of heavy square stones, reaching high above the 1- and 2-story shops. The boys realized at once this was Lukos's house. To the left of it was the massive edifice of the Baths of Diana. On the other building, around here, of the same height. Between the two buildings yawned a narrow, dark gully. From Lukos's house, a rectangular spot of light fell across this space and upon the wall of the Baths of Diana. There's a door open in Lukos's house, Julia said softly. Wait, Antonius whispered, and he crawled forward on hands and knees as far as the edge of the splash of light. Then he flattened out on his belly and squinted over the threshold. He withdrew his head hastily and crawled backwards to them. Tellus is in there, he reported. What is he doing? Mucius asked. Nothing. Where's Lukos? Flavius asked anxiously. I don't see him, Antonius replied. I didn't see him, Antonius replied. What was the next step? If the boys crossed in front of the door, Tellus would certainly see them. They stared indecisively into the dark gully, not daring to go forward and unwilling to go back. And then they noticed several thin rays of light in the wall about halfway between their observation post and the door. Mucius crept over to this light, and then he beckoned the others to follow, but he held a warning finger to his mouth. The light came from the window over which heavy boards had been nailed. There were cracks between the boards, and the boys pressed their faces against the wet board and peered through. The window was also protected with iron bars, but they could see directly into the big vaulted room in which they had been received by Lukos. It was darker than it had been when they last saw it, for there was no fire in the fireplace, and the horrible masks on the pillars were not lit up either. A dim lantern was burning on the table on which Lukos had sat. The ceiling and the distant corners of the room were shrouded in dense shadows. On the table, the boys spotted the basket of snakes, but it was covered over with a cloth. Next to it lay a short sword with a wide blade. Tellus was sitting on a hassock and wiping the rain from his face. The cloak lay on the floor beside him. He seemed to be waiting for something. For now and then he tilted his head to one side and listened attentively. He's waiting for Lukos, Flavius breathed. But suddenly Tellus jumped up and crossed the vaulted room rapidly and vanished behind a curtain which hung across a niche in one wall. There's another room, Cassius said. Lukos is probably in there, Mucius declared. Or the Red Wolf, Antonius said. Or we could hear what they are saying, Euseus said impatiently. But Tellus and Lukos remained behind the curtain. The boys could hear someone talking, but could not make out the words. I'll sneak over to the door and listen, Euseus said. I'm coming too, Cassius volunteered. So am I, Antonius said. Xanthippus told us to keep together, Flavius complained. All right then, Euseus said. We'll all go. Take off your sandals. If we make the slightest noise, we're done for. Stick close behind me. If I call, watch out, we'll all make a dash for it. Through the bakery, remember. They slipped their sandals off, made a small heap of them next to the wall, and stole up to the door. For a while they stared into the vaulted room. It remained empty, and Mucius led the way across the threshold. He walked on tiptoe, placing one foot ahead of the other very slowly, balancing himself with his arms. Every so often he paused and stood motionless, listening. The others followed his example. At last they reached the curtain and remained standing in front of it, holding their breath. From behind it they could hear a mysterious tinkling metallic sound, and a hoarse voice murmured, 100, 200, 300. Mucius moved the curtain aside ever so slightly and found himself looking into a cellar-like chamber. The windowless stone walls glistened with dampness. On a small table stood a flickering candle that had almost burned down. Tellus was nowhere in sight, but Lukos sat with his back to the curtain. Mucius recognized him at once by his long, dirty yellow hair and the black cloak with the silver stars sewn on it. The soothsayer was very busy counting heaps of gold pieces which were stacked up on the table. As he finished with each stack, he pushed it into a bag. He was completely absorbed in what he was doing and went on murmuring, 400, 500, 600, but suddenly he stopped and whirled around toward the curtain. His face was not painted black and white this time. Instead, he wore a clay mask tied over his face, the kind worn by actors on the stage. For a while, he stared fixedly at the curtain, and then he jumped to his feet. Frightened, Mucius let go of the curtain. Watch out, let's run, he whispered sharply. Flavius was the first to move. He shot toward the door as if he had been catapulted, and then he tripped over a tight string stretched across the floor and fell forward on his face. Immediately, the back door banged shut. The boys threw themselves against it in despair, tugging and pulling, but in vain. Don't bother, a hoarse voice said. You won't get it open. Lukos had drawn the curtain aside and confronted the boys. They could see his eyes glittering evilly behind the clay mask. With clumsy footsteps, he slowly approached them, and the boys instinctively moved closer together. Flavius was still stretched out on the floor, not moving. Either he was paralyzed by fright or plain dead. Lukos went up to the fallen Flavius, stooped with a groan, and pulled the boy by the hair. Help! Flavius screamed piercingly. He sprang up to his feet like a flash and fled towards his friends. Lukos gave a short laugh, and then he sat down on the hassock, folded his arms, and said menacingly, I knew you were coming. You fell into the trap. This time you won't escape me. If you do anything to us, I'll tell my father, Cassius said. You will never have the opportunity to tell your father anything again, Lukos replied. A chilled silence followed. Finally, Mucius cleared his throat and said somewhat hoarsely, We don't want any trouble with you. We saw Tellus going in here. Tellus is not here, Lukos said sharply. Isn't he in there? Mucius ventured, pointing to the curtain. Tellus has gone home, Lukos said. A door in there leads to the side street. But his cloak is lying there, Cassius said. For a moment, Lukos stared at the cloak lying beside the hassock. Then he croaked. He was in a hurry to get home. Let us go home too, Flavius cried in a shaky voice. Oh no, Lukos said. You have no right to keep us here, Julius said defiantly. You have no right to come spying around here, Lukos replied mockingly. People who pry into dangerous places must expect unpleasantness. We are not afraid. We are Romans, Mucius said heroically. Bravo, my son, Lukos chuckled. You have no need to be afraid. I'm not going to hurt you. That sounded a good deal pleasanter, and the boys breathed easier. Perhaps Lucas was not as bad as he pretended to be. You mustn't put a spell on us either, Antonius said. I know a lot better wizard than you. He'd take the spell right off right away. I do not bother with enchantments, Lucos said tartly. I can only see things that are hidden from other people. This is how I know why you are here. You are looking for the desecrator of the temple. You think he is Tellus. The boys were taken aback. Lucos not only had second sight, he could even read thoughts. Mucius nodded assent. We don't know for sure that it is Tellus, he said, but we suspect him. Perhaps it was the Red Wolf. Do you happen to know who the Red Wolf is? Lucos sat as though stunned for a moment, and then he suddenly jumped to his feet, waved his arms wildly, and screeched in fury. There is no Red Wolf. Tellus is innocent. I am the desecrator of the temple. I alone.